All right, so hi everybody. I am super excited to be here to share with you the fluency practices that I have implemented in my classroom. I am a third grade teacher out of Western New York in a very small rural district called Westfield. When I mean small, we have 34 kids in our grade level for the entire school. So we have one building where we have pre-K through 12 all in just one tiny little building. So we are very small, but our district is also significantly economically disadvantaged. As a district, we have 75% of our schools meet that marker for economically disadvantaged. And in our actual elementary, that number goes up to 92%. So the kids in our district are not really the most affluent. They're not the ones that have the parents that have the extra money to support their, outside of the classroom learning needs if they're necessary. So it kind of falls upon us as the teachers to really make that impact even more for them. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. So what I hope you guys are able to walk away with at the end of this presentation is I'm going to share with you from my classroom my whole class data set. One thing about my classroom is I had a co-taught classroom, so 33% of my classroom is qualified for specific learning disabilities. I had a total of 18 students, so you will see their data. I will give you a couple of actionable routines that you can implement in your classroom, share some videos of my actual students and some audio for you to pick up on the routines that I'm sharing and just how they all kind of led to me to have different questions that I could ask in order to find more clarity in the information that I was getting from my students. All right, so every year, we identify students who are below benchmark. Every grade level has that benchmark number. When it comes to third grade, that benchmark number for oral reading fluency at the end of it is 112 words per minute. And that was kind of what that number means. That was part of the title of the session. But benchmarks only answer that one question, which is where is that student? It doesn't answer the harder question of why is that student there? So throughout this presentation, you're going to hear where my students were at, and I'm going to be able to figure out why some of those students were where they were at. So we all know that fluency in reading is a very important foundational piece. I like to tell people that when it comes to third grade kind of is that kind of transitional phase for kids. They come up from K1, 2, really focusing on decoding skills and learning their phonics and being able to read words. And then they move up into the upper elementary where they're expected to have that comprehension piece. And in third grade, it's also when the state testing often starts to occur. And so it's kind of this bridge year. And fluency really is a tool that we can use to focus on to bring those kids from that basic word reading into the stronger comprehension piece. And one of the ways we can do that is we don't just look at fluency as just how fast a kid can read, but we also think of fluency about the accuracy of their reading. We're thinking about how fast they are reading. And then we're also really focusing on that prosody. And that's the expression and the adding the meaning to the words and the sentences that they are reading out loud. Jan Hasbrook is one of the researchers that is very known in the world of fluency. She has said that oral reading fluency is one of the best indicators of overall reading competence because it has a strong relationship with comprehension. There was a study that was done using the dibbles that showed that 80 to 90% probability of meeting later reading outcome goals if they were reading at their benchmark oral reading fluency levels. So again, it's an incredible, powerful tool, getting those benchmarks to see if a student is likely to be able to understand what it is they are also reading. So in my classroom, like I mentioned earlier, I have 18 students in my classroom, and 1/3 of my class is qualified for special education, and then the rest of the class. So that ended up being about 12 gen ed students and 6 identified students. So if you look at this chart here, there's three different lines on it. The line at the bottom in the red is my SPED identified students. So you can see at the beginning of the year, their average oral reading fluency number was 24 words per minute. Throughout the year, they moved up to 39.4 words per minute. You can also see that middle line, that is the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms for third grade. So typical third graders, to be at the 50th percentile, should be reading 83 words per minute at the beginning of the year and 112 by the spring. So you can see my SPED group was significantly below that, but they still managed to grow throughout the year. And then that line that is above, that is my Gen Ed group. So my Gen Ed group came in already above the norms. And you can see that they started out as a group at 103 words per minute and grew up to 143 words per minute. So you can see I had a very big gap between basically the haves and the have-nots in the room. But you can also see that both groups moved along their growth for their oral reading fluency throughout the year. This data here comes from iReady. So we also use iReady as a screener, as a diagnostic tool in our district. This is just another way that we can look at these two different groups that I had in my classroom. So my Gen Ed students, that's the top line, they grew from, like I said, about 40 words per minute in their oral reading fluency. Their iReady, they grew 193% of their expected growth. My identified students had about a 14, 15 word per minute gain, and then they grew about 110% of their expected growth on iReady. So you can see that they both made significant gains when you look at them in this context. And if you put those two groups together for my whole class, the numbers come down to a place where it's much closer to your average typical classroom. So I had, as a whole class, it was about 32 words per minute that they grew, and their iReady was 165%. The reason I'm giving you these two different metrics is because there's often an idea that growth and proficiency are equivalent things, and they really aren't, especially when you're thinking of groups that have like the Gen Ed kids versus the special ed kids. And if I looked at just my special ed students, word per minute gain, you would think that they didn't really learn a lot this year. But then when you look at their iReady and they grew 110% of their expected growth, it shows that they really did have a lot of growth, even though they're not at that same bar as my Gen Ed group was. So how did we get my class to do this? How did I get both of these groups to make these gains along their own pathway? The biggest thing that we did in my classroom is my co-teacher and I, we worked to take our curriculum. We use Wonders, and we looked at it with a very careful eye. And we looked for the gaps in the program and what we felt needed to be addressed. And one of the weakest components of Wonders is that it did not have a strong fluency component. So we wanted to do something that helped us grow our students' reading fluency alongside of their comprehension as well. And so we did that by creating new fluency passages that were connected to our stories that we were reading in our core curriculum of Wonders. And we took the vocabulary from our Wonders curriculum and embedded those words into our new passages that we used for fluency, to allow the students to have access to those words through different context, but they were still practicing them repeatedly. So this is the routine that we created in our classroom for our fluency practice. Every week it looked identical. We started it out at the beginning of the year, and we made this basically a non-negotiable part of our reading block. On Mondays, we always started with our vocabulary, and we would introduce the words. We would make sure that they were saying the words, they learned how to spell the words. We broke them apart into their different morphemes or into different pieces to help them understand how to decode the words. Um, and then we would move into our introducing our fluency passages, and we would echo read the passage with our students. I had the gen ed group that I worked directly with, and my co-teacher had her group of special ed kids that she read her passages with them. And then they would partner up and they would go partner read with their partners. That was Monday. Then on Tuesday, they met with their partner and they read through the passage 2 times each and then went back to their desks. Same thing Wednesday and Thursday. But then on Friday, we didn't want to take these passages that the students had been working hard to read and not do anything else with them. It wasn't just going to be a read and forget about them. We wanted to make sure that they were understanding and using that information as well. And so we tied our Friday into they would silently read their passage to themselves, and then we just gave them a real quick comprehension quiz. It was usually 3 to 5 multiple choice questions. As the year went on, we added in a short constructed response as well. So this is a look at the 2 different passages. So like I said, I had 2 different groups in my classroom. We had my gen ed population and I had my special ed population. So this passage came from our unit that we were doing in Wonders. We were reading about, the unit was called Moving America Forward. And it was about Henry Ford and the Model T and how that, helped move history forward in America. So we created these passages. We used AI to help us create these. You can see by looking at it, there are the bolded words that are in the passage. Those are the vocabulary words that came directly from our core text. So they're reading them in their fluency passages. They're seeing them in the story that we are also reading that in our complex text work later on in our ELA blocks. And then you can see that there's the sped passage on the other side. You notice that all of the vocabulary words are still there. That was a very intentional choice on our part. We know that those special ed students need exposure to that same grade level vocabulary. And if they don't have that exposure, then they're kind of being lost. The only difference between these 2 passages is that we dropped the reading level to put it at a more of a decodable place for that sped group, which is more on the 2nd grade level, which is what their IPs were identifying they were reading at. So the content's the same, the information's the same. The vocabulary stayed the same. We just dropped the reading level for them. So when it comes to that same thing, again, we kept the same routine between the 2 groups. We kept the same rigor for the 2 groups. The only thing we did is we adjusted the access that the special ed group had for that. So everything in the content, the vocabulary, the way that we ran our groups with each other, they were all the same. The only difference is that we dropped that reading level down to the 2nd grade, and my sped teacher was there to give them more specific feedback and scaffolding as they were introduced to the passages. When we broke into our groups, we used partner reading, and the specific type of partner reading that we used is called dyad reading pairs. Dyad reading is a very evidence-based instructional approach. And what it does is it pairs a higher reader with a lower reader, but in a very strategic way, so you're not getting a very large gap between the 2. So, for example, this is the data from my 12 gen ed students at the middle of the year. You can see that my top reader could read 187 words per minute, and then my lowest gen ed student read 69 words per minute. That's a very large gap between these 2 students. So if I had partnered them together, that would be really difficult for both of them. The lower student would be like, I don't want to read with them. They're way better than me. So when you make dyad pairs, you rank all of your students, then you split your list in half and then kind of line them back up. So you can see on the second side here how my 187 student is now partnered with a 130 level student. That's a much smaller gap than if they had been with the 69 words per minute student. So here's an example of my students participating in their dyad reading pairs. So you will see that there are two students together. They are reading the same passage and they're taking turns reading paragraph for paragraph. The reason this works is because one of the students is a more fluent model, and it creates that scaffold for that other student who's right there next to them to hear more fluent reading. And if they get stuck, they have somebody there that's able to assist them along the way. So here is their video.
Agreeable to the idea of using machines to travel, while others were unsure. Still, inventors kept improving the designs. In the early 1900s, automobiles became easier to build and easier to buy. Factories found faster ways to make cars, and the automobile industry more people could own cars, not just the wealthy. As transportation improved, people began to appreciate how much time and effort automobiles save. As cars became more common, roads were built to connect places and resources more quickly across the country. Farmers, workers, and businesses all benefited from faster transportation. Today, automobiles are a normal part of daily life. Our descendants still use vehicles even though they look different from the first automobiles. Each event in history is unique because it happens at a different time and solves different problems. The invention of the automobile was special because it changed how people traveled and helped move the country forward.
So you noticed in that video that there was multiple partners all doing the same exact routine together. And they were spaced out around the room so that they had their space so they could hear their partner. If you listen carefully, I hope you also picked up on that there was one student that seemed to be that higher, more fluent reader, and the other student was slightly lower, and but they were able to learn from each other and switch back and forth. So they're constantly getting that model for them within that process. Because of this routine that we created in our classroom, it allowed me also then to identify students that were having a more difficult time with building their fluency and turn this 10 minutes of classroom instruction time into a focused intervention piece that I could target those students. So if we go actually back to my data from the dyad partners, you will see those two students, my 84 and the 69. Those two students were reading below benchmark at the middle of the school year. And they're the two students that I was able to target for further instruction within this intervention part of our, with the intervention part for our oral reading fluency. So what I did differently with these two students is instead of partnering them off with other students in the classroom, I pulled them two separately at a separate table, and I sat there with them and focused on giving them more targeted feedback, and helping them if they struggled with decoding or phrasing. I was able to be right there and give them that support. In this video that we're going to watch next, you're going to see me sitting there at the table. You're not going to see the other two students. They're going to be just off camera, but they're reading a passage and they are working on their taking turns reading back and forth. And I want you to listen for two different things. I want you to listen first for the expression that they are using in their voices. That expression is showing that they are comprehending the words that they're reading on that page in real time. I also want you to notice how I'm giving feedback when they do make a mistake, how quickly it's given, how short and direct it is, and it sends them right back into their reading without me trying to reteach them something in that moment in time.
Inside, when an old woman invited them in. Eat as much as you like, she said. The women wasn't good. It lasted for a week. Each day, the managed to feel him. Show me your food, she cried. And so that was tiny bones that trickled. Finally, the witch stamped her foot. I will wait no longer, she yelled. She told Gretel to check the oven. Gretel considered to save her brother.
Oh, let's go back. How to save her brother.
How
Say that
to.
again. Gretel.
Gretel considered how to save her brother. I do not understand how this works, she said.
So in that clip, like I said, you notice that they were adding that expression in. They became that witch in that moment, reading that dialogue. It's showing that they're comprehending in real time what it is that's happening in the story. That wasn't something that was modeled for them. That wasn't something that I had told them to do. It was something that they just naturally did because they were able to move past those decoding barriers and become fluent readers. And we've been practicing how to add expression to our words throughout the year. And then you also saw that I gave that real quick, short feedback to the student who stumbled along the way. And it didn't require a lot of extra time, but it gave him that second chance to read it in a much more fluent manner. So these two students, I ended up doing a whole series on my Substack about my intervention that I ran with them across 8 weeks. And this is kind of the overall data that I collected along the way. So as I was working with these two students in a more focused way, I started to run two different sets of assessment data. They did their weekly oral reading fluency passage that they were practicing. They did their comprehension at the end of the week on Friday, like I shared earlier. But I also started to add in two different timings for them. So I needed to see if the extra work was supporting them or if it wasn't helping them move, if it wasn't moving the needle for their growth. So you can see I have student A. She started out at 69 words per minute was her baseline. And student B was at 84 words per minute as his baseline. Each week I did a brand new cold read passage. A cold read passage is one that they've never seen before. It's at the third grade level, and I'm timing them to see if they are able to transfer their practices from the weekly repeated readings into a new unknown passage. But I also wanted to see how they were doing with their passages that they were very familiar with. So those are called hot reads. So that's the passage that they have been practicing all week long. And I wanted to see that gap between those two. So if you looked at, you can see I have student A's. The first column is student A's cold reads. You will see student A's hot reads in the second column. And you will notice that her cold reads never really moved very much throughout the 8 weeks, but her hot read showed that she had the capacity to be very near that benchmark number of 112. If you look at student B, his story kind of says something a little bit different. He started at 84 words and he consistently moved up in both his cold reads and his hot reads. They consistently both advanced. So I ended up having like these two different competing narratives between these two students. This is just another way to look at that same data. You can see the orange mark is that 112 benchmark number that we were trying to get both of them to. And the purpose is I wanted to try to get them there before they had to take their ELA test, um, to help them be able to access the content on that test as best as they could. And so you see, student B was able to cross that threshold by the time we were done with those 8 weeks of focused feedback and instruction, whereas student A really struggled and really never moved much along the way. So this now is, I want you to now listen for what was going on. I'm talking about the cold reads, I'm talking about the hot reads, but what does that really sound like in practice? So I'm going to start with student B, and this is student B's final cold read. So this is the new passage that he had never seen before in him reading that.
Okay, go ahead and begin when you're ready.
Karen loves to swim. She likes the way the water felt against her skin. When she kicked her legs, she could feel the water pushing against her. Her dad told her that pushing was what helped her swim so fast. Karen was very fast swimmer. In the summer, Karen would swim in a lake near her house. It was a very deep lake, and the water was always cold. Karen was only allowed to swim in the lake when her adults were also. Her parents told her it was too dangerous for children to swim in the lake by themselves. Karen knew she was a good swimmer, but she...
Good. All right, you can go.
Oops, sorry. Let's jumped way too far. So you noticed in there, he still struggled in a couple of spots with some unfamiliar words, but he was able to read other sections much more connected along the way. Now, this time, listen for the difference between the unknown and something that he was very familiar with.
All right, go ahead and begin.
Hansel and Gretel lived in a humble home near a dark forest. The family was very poor. One night, Hansel heard his parents talking. They considered what to do because they had no food. The next day, their father led them in the woods, to the woods. Hansel was clever. He just wants to find the way home. Later, they went back into the forest. This time, Hansel dropped breadcrumbs. The birds ate them, Hansel cried. We are lost! They walked until they saw a magnificent house made of candy. What an amazing creation, Gretel said. They hesitated at the door. They reluctantly stepped inside when the old woman invited them in. That's not as you like, she said. The woman was a witch. She locked Hansel in a cage.
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to actually come out of full screen now because I want to actually see what are your guys' thoughts when you hear the difference between the cold read and the hot read?
And Henry should be a part of it.
What are some things you noticed about them? You can type them in the chat or you can feel free to unmute yourself and share. Yeah, like his prosody was very different. He had a very big difference in his confidence, right? You hear he's giving the expression for the sounds of the witch. All right, so now we're going to listen to student A. She was, she's the one that really struggled with her cold read and those gains. And so we're going to start with her cold read this time.
All right, go ahead. Yep.
Karen loved to swim. She liked the way the water felt against her skin. When she moved her legs, she could feel the Her dad told her to push what helped her swim so fast. Cameron was a very fast swimmer. In the summer, Cameron swam in a lake near her house. It was very deep. It was a very deep lake, and the water was also always cold.
Okay, so that was her cold read. Now listen to the difference between that and her hot read.
Go ahead and begin.
Hansel and Gretel lived in a humble home near a dark forest. Their family was very poor. One night, Hansel heard his parents talking. They considered what to do because they had no food. The next day, their father led them into the woods. Hansel was clever and brought stones to find his way home. Later, they went back into the forest. This time, Hansel brought the breadcrumbs. The birds ate them, Hansel cried. We're lost. Hansel entered a magnificent house made of candy. What an amazing creation, Gretel said. They hesitated at the door. They reluctant.
Okay, so now what did you notice this time between those two reads for her? For me, I noticed that she was very, very reluctant at the beginning of her in her cold read. She was kind of stuck, like she was really struggling. And if you listen to her cold read, you would almost wonder if she couldn't decode the words in front of her. But when you moved over, right, you saw that she was very quiet, right? That even just the volume of her voice is very different in her cold read. Then when she goes to something that she was really truly confident in, you realize that she can decode fine. She knew what the words were. They weren't the struggle. So there was something that was going on with her that made me start to ask some different questions. So I started to ask, like I move to the next one. Okay. So student B, he was your typical student that you have in your class. He just needed some more focused attention and practice. The repeated reading routine that we set up and as part of our fluency instruction worked for him. He was able to cross that 112 barrier. His comprehension improved. He was doing everything that we hope an intervention would do for a student. But student A, same student as, same gen ed student, she is doing the same routine. She had the same supports, but it didn't work for her. So the question now became, was this a decoding issue in disguise? Is it caused anxiety? Was it a processing issue? And so I started to dig a little bit deeper for her because I now had this new question. What is going on for her? What is blocking her? And my first thing that I did is when I gave her a cold read, I assessed her across 3 different attempts within 5 minutes. And her first time, she read 44 words per minute. I literally tested her a minute later and she read 64 words per minute. And then I tested her a third time 1 minute later and was already up to 90 words correct. So what is causing this block that she has? Again, same routine for both of these kids, but 2 very different results in the end. And so what I moved on to next was I wanted to make sure it wasn't decoding. So I gave her a word reading fluency. I wanted to see if she could read them. We did nonsense words to see if her phonics were in place. All of that came back that she was capable of doing, of the decoding. Decoding wasn't the problem. So then I reached for something else that I was seeing as a pattern across also math. She was really slow at pulling her math facts in. We do timed math fact retrieval practice as well. And she could answer all of the questions. She could figure out the answers to them, but she just did it very slowly. So then I administered a RAN assessment. And this is something that speech and language pathologists often will assess for. And her RAN score, a RAN is a rapid automatic naming task. It takes numbers or letters and just asks them to as quickly name them as fast as they can. It's something that they are very familiar with. It's not new information. They're just naming something that is a familiar item in a quick succession. And when it did that, she came back at about 35% slower than typical third graders would answer those questions. If I put this all
Give the heads up, we're within the 4 minutes.
Yep, I'm finishing up.
Okay.
Thanks.
No, I'm enjoying it so much.
I know. If I put this all together with the way the rest of her school year ended, she also showed really, really slow work when it came to doing the final diagnostic assessments. It took her so much longer than the average kid in my classroom took to do those tests. And I feel like a lot of these issues with this rapid automatic naming is showing that there's an underlying retrieval processing delay. So what this was allowed me to do was take her to a CST team and give them this information, be like, this student is, I had new information that now I could advocate for her to get the supports necessary that she needed. So just closing it out. So when we think of, 112 words per minute was never the destination that my students needed to get to. Benchmarks are great, but it's really the process of seeing how we got there and looking deeper at the data and the questions we can answer when one thing's working and one thing's not working. So if anybody has any questions, let me get back into the chat and show the meeting. All right, I can stop screen sharing now, right?
Stephanie, I don't have a question, but that's the best 40 minutes of PD I've had. I'm a relatively new teacher. I just finished my 4 years. That was really exceptional.
Thank you.
I want to see the math version.
Right? Yeah, Elizabeth, I think we all have children like these two kids in our classrooms, and we often kind of overlook, especially student A, like she often would get seen as like the kid that is just slow or just takes too much time. And the worry then becomes that when she gets to fifth grade and everything becomes more complex, is she going to be looked at as the kid that just doesn't try hard enough, right? And I was able to find this gap for her and advocate for her so she's not hopefully seen as that student by the time she gets to that middle school range.
Stephanie, do you tend to find that same phenomenon with reading comprehension? Because I feel like that right now is kind of my nut to crack, where it's like fluency is there, everything's there, and that comprehension just isn't really budging.
I think where the comprehension piece I think we have to look at comprehension differently too. It's not just focused on can they read the words on the page, but what do they do with that information? And that really comes from a lot more of building in like discussions and routines to really dive deeper into the text. But if they can't really get to just the clearing the hurdle of being able to read it, then that deeper dive really is even harder to get to, right? And so if they're able to clear that hurdle, so student B cleared that hurdle, but now that's where the work goes next, right? Is really diving into that more comprehension piece for those students.